panic briefly gripped Israel's parliament as Iranian missile alerts reached Jerusalem, forcing a late-night suspension of proceedings at the Knesset and sending lawmakers into protective shelter before the session resumed a short time later. Israeli officials said there were no immediate reports of injuries in Jerusalem from that specific barrage, even as fresh Iranian strikes underscored how deeply the war has unsettled daily life in Israel's political heart. The interruption at the Knesset came amid a wider and rapidly shifting regional crisis, with Iran and Israel still exchanging fire and Washington signaling a possible, if highly uncertain, opening for diplomacy. At the center of that opening was President Donald Trump, who announced that the United States would hold off for 5 days on previously threatened strikes against Iranian power plants and energy infrastructure. The pause, according to Trump, was meant to test whether a broader agreement could still be reached. Iran, however, swiftly denied that any negotiations with the United States were underway. The mixed messages exposed the confusion surrounding one of the most dangerous moments in the conflict so far. On one side, Trump presented the pause as evidence that recent military pressure had created leverage and opened a path toward a deal. On the other, Iranian officials described his account as false, manipulative, and designed to influence oil markets while buying time for military planning. Speaking publicly, Trump cast the delay as a tactical decision shaped by what he said were new diplomatic feelers. Based on preliminary conversations between the United States and Iran over the past 2 days, I've directed the Department of War to temporarily postpone planned strikes against major energy and electricity targets in Iran, he said. He argued that the United States now had an opportunity to determine whether the crisis could be diffused through talks rather than another round of attacks on infrastructure. Trump went further, suggesting that the pressure campaign had fundamentally changed Tehran's posture. They want to settle, and we're going to get it done, he said, presenting the coming days as a possible turning point in the war. Later in the same remarks, he added, "We are now having really good discussions," and insisted that there was a very good chance the confrontation could end in agreement rather than total destruction. He framed the pause not as restraint born of weakness, but as a deliberate choice to leave room for diplomacy while keeping the threat of overwhelming force intact. "We're giving it 5 days, and then we're going to see where that takes us," he said. He then made clear that military escalation remained an option, saying any deal could be just as effective as, in his words, literally annihilate place, though he added that avoiding such an outcome would be preferable. Reports on the U.S. side indicated that Trump's envoys, including Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, were involved in the contacts he described. Witkoff has been publicly identified in recent official U.S. material as a special envoy, while White House and State Department references over recent months have placed both men in sensitive diplomatic conversations. But even as Trump described the outreach as serious and productive, there was no public confirmation from Tehran that any direct or indirect channel had opened in the way he claimed. Iran's response was immediate and sharply worded. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, Speaker of Iran's parliament, rejected the suggestion that negotiations were taking place and accused Washington of spreading falsehoods for strategic gain. In public messaging carried by Iranian and international outlets, Tehran said no talks had been held with the United States and that the country's leadership remained focused instead on punishing what it called aggression by America and Israel. An Iranian statement dismissed the U.S. account in blunt terms. No negotiations have been held with the United States, Iranian officials said, according to multiple reports summarizing the denial. Tehran's position was that the story of productive talks was not a sign of progress, but a form of psychological and economic warfare. Iranian officials said such claims were being pushed to influence global oil and financial markets and to provide Washington and Tel Aviv with political breathing room. Iranian media tied to the country's power structure sharpened the message further. One semi-official report portrayed Trump's announcement not as diplomacy, but retreat. Another suggested that recent U.S. rhetoric reflected battlefield frustration rather than strategic confidence. The line coming from Tehran was unmistakable. Iran was not seeking an exit at any price, and certainly not on terms described by the White House. A military source cited by Iranian media said the coming phase of the war could bring new shocks. Iran has planned new surprises for the coming days of the ongoing war. The source was quoted as saying, adding that their implementation could bring very big results. The same messaging portrayed Trump as a leader searching for a way out of a military stalemate after finding that force alone had not produced the outcome he expected. Another Iranian message was especially pointed in its warning. Trump should take his head off his phone and social media for a while, the source said, before adding that his attention should now be fixed on the sky, the stock market, and the price of oil. That phrase captured the three pressure points Iran appeared eager to emphasize: missile and drone attacks, financial volatility, and the energy shock linked to instability around the Strait of Hormuz. The mention of energy markets was not rhetorical flourish. Oil prices had surged during the crisis, and the global market had become acutely sensitive to every sign of escalation or de-escalation.
Reports following Trump's 5-day pause said crude prices dropped sharply after his announcement, underscoring how closely traders were tracking the possibility of strikes on Iranian power infrastructure or wider disruption around the Gulf. That broader context helps explain why the Knesset incident resonated so strongly.
The missile alerts over Jerusalem were not an isolated scare, but part of a wider campaign in which Iran has sought to demonstrate that political centers, symbolic targets, and heavily defended urban areas remain vulnerable. Reports from March 24 said missiles were detected approaching Jerusalem, forcing lawmakers to shelter even as other strikes caused injuries elsewhere in Israel, including the Tel Aviv area. Inside Israel, the attacks have reinforced the argument made by Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that the confrontation is not simply a military exchange, but a direct assault on civilians. Visiting a missile impact site in southern Israel after earlier barrages, Netanyahu said Iran's intent was unmistakable. Their intention is to murder civilians, he declared, arguing that the absence of mass casualties in some strikes reflected luck and air defense performance rather than restraint on Tehran's part. His argument gained urgency after a series of Iranian missile strikes over recent days hit or threatened populated areas, including locations near Dimona and Arad in southern Israel. International reporting said some attacks caused significant injuries and structural damage, while Israeli emergency services have continued to respond to repeated barrages since the war's opening phase. The attacks have also fueled Israeli claims that Iran is willing to target sensitive areas and population centers in order to break deterrence and create fear far from the front lines.
At the same time, Israel has sought to project continuity in governance and military planning despite the pressure. The Knesset session in Jerusalem resumed roughly 15 minutes after the alert, according to reports. That relatively quick return was symbolically important. Even under missile threat, the state's institutions were meant to be seen as functioning.
Still, the interruption itself highlighted the basic reality that no part of Israel's public life is insulated from the conflict. The war's political messaging has become almost as consequential as the battlefield exchanges. Trump has insisted that American military pressure is producing results and forcing Iran to consider a way out. Iranian officials have insisted the opposite, that U.S. threats are failing, that Washington's munitions and options are narrowing, and that talk of peace is a public relations maneuver meant to recover leverage. The contradiction is not a side note. It has become a central front in the conflict itself. That front extends into the question of whether any diplomacy actually exists beneath the public posturing. Some reports have suggested regional intermediaries are trying to lower tensions or pass messages between the parties. But the specific claim of recent productive U.S.-Iran talks, as described by Trump, has not been publicly corroborated by Iranian officials, who have instead denied it outright. That leaves the world in an awkward place. A possible diplomatic track may exist somewhere behind the scenes, but the public positions remain fundamentally irreconcilable. Trump's own language has done little to reduce that uncertainty. In his remarks, he mixed optimism about negotiations with threats of vast destruction and sweeping claims about the elimination of Iranian leadership circles. That combination reflected the style of a president trying to present military dominance and diplomatic flexibility at the same time. But it also reinforced skepticism abroad, especially in Tehran, where officials portrayed his statements as bluster aimed at controlling perception rather than describing real negotiations. Meanwhile, reporting has suggested that the pause in attacks applies specifically to Iran's energy infrastructure, not necessarily to all categories of military targets. Reuters, citing a U.S. official through a semaphore report, said the temporary hold covered energy sites, while other categories remained exposed to continued pressure. That distinction matters because it shows the administration's move was not a full ceasefire gesture, but a selective pause tied to one especially sensitive class of targets with enormous regional and global economic implications. For Iran, that nuance appears to have changed little. Public statements from Tehran continued to stress punishment, deterrence, and unity behind the leadership. Rather than acknowledging pressure, Iranian officials depicted Trump as backtracking after being warned that retaliation against energy infrastructure could plunge the wider Middle East into darkness. This framing was meant not only for domestic audiences, but also for regional governments weighing how far they would align with Washington in the event of a deeper war. The stakes of that message are enormous because the conflict is now inseparable from the question of the Strait of Hormuz and the wider Gulf energy system. The strait remains one of the world's most strategically important oil transit routes, and every threat connected to it echoes instantly through shipping markets, insurance prices, state budgets, and consumer energy costs. Even when missiles are flying over Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, markets thousands of miles away are reacting to what might happen in Gulf waters next.
That is why Iran's language about the sky, the stock market, and the price of oil landed so sharply. It was both a threat and a summary of the conflict's real theater, air war, financial panic, and energy coercion. The warning suggested Tehran believes it can impose costs even if it cannot match the United States and Israel symmetrically in conventional force.
By keeping multiple fronts unstable at once, Iran appears to be signaling that no clean or low-cost victory is available to its adversaries. Israel, for its part, continues to argue that the conflict has clarified rather than complicated the threat. Netanyahu and other Israeli officials have used the repeated missile barrages to make the case that Iran's strategy is explicitly directed at civilians and national infrastructure, not merely military retaliation. That argument is central to Israel's attempt to maintain domestic cohesion and international support as the war grinds on. The late-night disruption in the Knesset therefore carried weight beyond the immediate security incident. It showed that the war has reached into the routines of government itself. Parliamentary debate like school schedules, emergency medicine, transportation, and commerce can now be suspended by a missile warning at any moment. Even when no one is hurt, the strategic effect is real. Public institutions operate under a constant shadow of interruption. For Washington, the next 5 days may prove decisive, but not necessarily in the way Trump has suggested. If genuine indirect contacts are underway, they will have to survive public denials, mutual threats, and continued battlefield escalation. If they are not underway, then the pause may amount to little more than a tactical delay before another dangerous turn. Either way, the contradiction between Trump's claim of progress and Iran's total rejection of that claim has become the central diplomatic fact of the moment. For now, the war remains suspended between two competing narratives. The first says military dominance has opened a narrow road to peace. The second says the aggressor is faltering and trying to disguise retreat as diplomacy. On the ground, neither narrative has yet stopped the missiles, calmed the Knesset, or removed the region from the brink. And so the image that remains is stark. Lawmakers in Jerusalem rushing to shelter, emergency crews scanning impact sites, oil markets swinging on presidential statements, and rival capitals claiming either victory or deception before the next round has even begun. In that atmosphere, every speech is part warning, part negotiation, and part battlefield maneuver. If you want, I can turn this into a cleaner TV package script next with shorter paragraphs, dramatic pacing, and voiceover-ready formatting.